Happy Mother's You can say Happy Mother's Day to me, too. I have a mother, I've had a wonderful mother, 57 years of a wonderful mother, and this is my first Mother's Day without my wonderful mother. And so it is a little emotional. I know a lot of you have gone through that, but this is my first one. We said goodbye to our mother last October. And Abraham Lincoln said that no man is poor who has had a godly mother. And I couldn't agree with that more. I am a rich man because I was raised by a godly mother. It's not easy to be a Christian mom today. It's perhaps more difficult than it's ever been. And some of you young mothers who are trying to balance work and raising your children and the church and the community and soccer practice and your marriage and all those things, it is so difficult to be a godly mother. But I just want to say that there's nothing more important than you can do than to raise the next generation of God-fearing young people. Proverbs 31:10 says, "A wife of noble birth, of noble character, is worth more than rubies." It's hard to be a Christian mom today. There was a lady at a bus station. She had like 6 or 7 kids, and she's trying to keep them, corralled and everything. And you could tell she was a little frazzled. And a guy walks up there to the bus stop, and he sees her, and he said, "Lady, are all these your kids, or are you just going on a picnic?" She said, "They're all mine, and believe me, it's no picnic." So it's no picnic. But there's nothing more important. There's a saying that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And I'm convinced that's true. There's no more important role in God's design for the family than the role of God-fearing mothers who impart their faith to the next generation. Now, there's a story in the Bible of, I think, a terrific example for a mother. She was just a real person. And the person I want to talk about is Hannah. And Hannah's story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So if you have a Bible, go to that. Hannah was, as I said, she was just real. She had her flaws. She had her moments of doubt and weakness and even breakdown. But she was a woman of tremendous faith and a woman of prayer. And she raised a son and imparted her faith to this boy who went on, his name was Samuel, and he went on to be one of Israel's greatest, absolute greatest prophets, and certainly Israel's greatest judge. So that's the story I want to look at today as we, I guess, try to glean a little something on being a godly mother who transfers her faith along to her children. And I think that's what we all want. The story of Samuel's birth through his mother Hannah is found in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And there was a certain man. Now, let me back up. There's 4 key characters here in this story. There is Elkanah. Elkanah, he's the husband. All right? And then I'm going to pronounce it Peniah. It's probably pronounced different, but I can't figure out how to pronounce it. So there's Peniah and Hannah. Okay, so Elkanah had 2 wives at the same time. He was a polygamist, and that's part of the problem here. He had 2 wives. One wife's name was Peniah, and the other was Hannah. Hannah couldn't have children. And that was just awful for her. Peniah was the opposite. She was fertile myrtle. I mean, she's dropping a kid every 10 months, which added to Hannah's frustration and Hannah's problem. So there's Elkanah, his wife Peniah, a.k.a. fertile myrtle, Poor Hannah, who can't have children. And then the fourth character would be Samuel. All right, so let's look at this story. 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim and Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Don't let all those names confuse you. We're talking about Elkanah. He had two wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, lots of them. But Hannah had none. And year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophnius and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. And whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all his sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. And this went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? I think that's a stupid thing to say, but I don't think he was the most sensitive man in the world. Tell a woman who desperately wants to have children, aren't I? Work more anyway. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty. Now let me just stop there. And if you have a Bible open, you ought to note that phrase she uses for God. She refers to God as Lord Almighty. And in the Hebrew, in the original language, that is one of the great Hebrew names for God that's used in the Old Testament. I think there's like 17 specific names for God. And this is Lord Almighty, which means Yahweh Sabaoth. Yahweh Sabaoth, which means the Lord of the armies of heaven. In other words, commander-in-chief of the millions and billions of angels making up the army of heaven. So it's kind of the name that the Hebrew people would use. It's kind of God's fighting name, okay? You may have chariots and horses and a sophisticated military, but we have Yahweh Sabaoth. He is the commander and general of the armies of heaven. And nothing that you have can compare. So when Hannah's saying this prayer, she is crying out to Yahweh Sabaoth. She is referring to God as the God who's in charge, the commander-in-chief of the armies of heaven. It's a significant point. O Lord Almighty, Yahweh Sabaoth, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, and then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. And as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And Eli thought, she must be drunk. And he said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." And Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. And early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then they went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." So we have this woman, Hannah, imperfect. She's got flaws, flies off the handle maybe when she gets provoked. But this is a godly woman. And she raised one of the great, great men in all of history in the Old Testament. She raised Samuel, the great prophet and priest. Now, how did she do that? I mean, what was her method? How did she impart this faith that she had to this boy Samuel, who became this great leader? And I think it's three things. Number one, Hannah was a woman of faith, and that faith just transferred to her son. Number two, she was a woman of prayer, and she prayed and partnered with God for this boy. And number three, she was very intentional about transferring her faith to her son. So Hannah was, first of all, a woman of faith. In spite of her circumstances, in spite of the thought that she was barren, she could never have children. In fact, it's very possible that the reason Elkanah took a second wife was because Hannah wasn't giving him children. That's just a double slap in the face. But Hannah was a woman of faith. She didn't give up. She kept going, trusting, believing in Yahweh Sabaoth, the commander of the armies of heaven, that he could do something about her situation. She was a woman of faith. Someone said faith is expecting the best from God. I think that's a good definition of faith. It's not saying that, faith doesn't say that, well, everything's going to work out great for me just the way I want it. That's not faith. That's just wishful thinking. Faith says, I expect the best from God. I expect that God will do what is best for his agenda, what is best for his kingdom, what is best for me ultimately. And Hannah was a woman of tremendous faith in spite of this dysfunctional family that she was a part of. Dysfunctional in three ways. Number one, she was barren. And in Bible times, I mean, this is never an easy thing for any woman to deal with. And often it's Mother's Day that women are reminded of that. It's never in any culture easy to deal with the prospect of not being able to have children when you want them. But in Bible times, if you can imagine, it was 10 times worse. It was a stigma upon you. It was a black stain. It meant, at least they believed that if you were barren, it's because there was something wrong with you. God was punishing you. And so you were looked upon as almost a second-class citizen. So Hannah has to live with that. And she also had to live with the fact that her husband was a polygamist. I don't know any woman that wants to share their husband with somebody else, and certainly not Fertile Myrtle, who's popping out a kid every 10 months. And then to comprehend all of that, Fertile Myrtle is her antagonist, it says. And she would intentionally say things to irritate Hannah because she was jealous too of Elkanah, who they shared, the husband they shared. She would antagonize her with her words. I think for the most part, Hannah tried to stay away from her. But every year when they would take this big family vacation and go to Shiloh, to the house of the Lord for sacrifices, she couldn't get away from Peninnah. And so they'd be walking along, and Peninnah, she'd say something like, oh, look at little Joseph. He's just growing so fast, getting into everything. Well, you wouldn't know what that's like, would you, Hannah? Because you don't have any kids. Oh, and little Mary, she's just growing up so fast. She's become such a fine young lady. She sewed her own dress last week. Elkanah's so proud of her. Well, you wouldn't know what that's like, would you, Hannah? Because you don't have any kids. Oh, the kids are so excited this time of year. They just love this family trip that we take. You wouldn't know what that's like, would you, Hannah? And she would just needle her and antagonize her. And it got to the point where Hannah she didn't take it very well. She would leave the room crying, and she wouldn't eat, and Elkanah would have to go and console her. It was not a healthy situation. But the key is, Hannah remained a woman of faith. And ladies, that is such an important virtue, to maintain your faith in a less than perfect situation. I think anyone can be a person of faith when, all is right with the world. But the real test is when things aren't so perfect. And the fact is, I believe that God designed mothers to be kind of the calming effect in the home. There's an old saying, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Moms, you're the calming effect in the home. To maintain your faith, to maintain this virtue when things are less than perfect around the home is a great virtue. So Hannah was a woman of faith through it all. She just kept going, trusting, believing in Yahweh Sabaoth. Number 2, she was a woman of prayer. This passionate prayer where she pours out her soul in anguish, that isn't the first time this woman has ever prayed. You get the idea that she was a woman. This was where she went. This was her sanity, her source of sanity. This was her strength. Hannah was a praying woman. And I want to challenge you young mothers and you old mothers and you grandmothers to pray for your children. Pray for your grandchildren. Something that dawned on me not too long ago, just here in the last year, is that I have lived 57 years of my life with the knowledge, consciously, subconsciously, I have just known that I have a mother who has prayed for me. And every day I know that I've had a mother that has prayed for me every single day. I know that. And I can look back, honestly, I can look back over my life and I can see so many times that I was spared, that I was saved. You see, moms, it's not enough to pray for your children's physical safety. We do that, don't we? Moms pray. We worry, I'm going home now. Well, drive careful, we worry about their physical safety. But I would suggest to you, more important is your children's spiritual safety. Because there is an adversary out there, isn't there? And he's like a lion, roaring, prowling, seeking to devour our children and destroy them spiritually. And I don't know if there's ever been a time in our culture where there are more attacks on our children than there are today. in school, through the media. They go off to college and come back atheists. And moms, you need to pray for your children, for their spiritual safety. Pray, call out to Yahweh Sabaoth. God, you are the God of the armies of heaven. Will you spiritually protect my son today? Will you spiritually protect my daughter? Because I'm telling you, looking back, there were times when I was spiritually protected. There are things that I didn't get into, and I don't know why I didn't get into until now that I look back and realize I had a mother praying to protect me from these things. No man is poor who's had a godly mother. One of the last things my mom told me is our prayers don't end when we die. Our prayers don't end when we die. The things that we appealed to God for, they don't just stop because we die. That's a comforting thought, isn't it? James chapter 1 verse 5 says, if any of you lack wisdom, he should ask God, who gives it generously to all. Hannah was a praying mother. So she was a woman of faith. She was a woman of prayer. And then the third thing is that she was a woman of purpose. She intentionally passed her faith along to her son. God granted her prayer of anguish, and she gave birth to a son. And Hannah made a big vow, didn't she? She made a big promise to God, a big, bold promise. If you will give me a son, I will return him to you, and he'll live all his days unto you. And she did it. She honored that promise. She committed her son to God, and she honored it. She committed her son to God, and so should you commit your sons and daughters to God. And I don't just mean, a baby dedication, which is a wonderful thing to do, by the way, but a daily committing to God, this is your daughter. God, this is your son. I commit them to you. She made a big, bold vow, and she followed through with it. When my grandmother was born, well over 100 years ago, she, according to her story, my grandmother could spin a yarn, but according to her, she didn't even weigh 2 pounds. And she wasn't born in a hospital, but she said, I didn't even weigh 2 pounds, and everybody thought I was going to die. But her father, my great-grandfather, who I never met, went outside and called out to God and said, God, please spare this little girl. If you will, I dedicate her to you. I will do everything I can to raise her to be a fine Christian lady. And obviously, God answered that prayer because I'm here. But my grandmother was a woman of tremendous Christian faith and passed it along to my mother. I don't want to get too personal here, but my dad's not a Christian. And I can really relate to Timothy, where Paul said, I am first reminded of your living faith, your genuine faith that first lived in your mother Lois and in your grandmother Lois, and I am persuaded now lives in you. But Hannah was intentional about passing her faith. It says in verse 24 of the first chapter that after Samuel was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, she brought the boy to Eli, the old priest. And she said to him, Pardon me, my Lord, as surely as you live, I am the same woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord. Now, some of you are wondering, how in the world could she do that? I mean, you've waited your whole life for a child and you finally get one and you go hand it off to an old priest? Well, it wasn't quite like that, all right? It wasn't like, dropping your kid off at the steps of the courthouse or something. Number one, we're really not sure how old Samuel was. When it says after he was weaned, some scholars think that means 3 years old. Some say he could have been 11 years old. And I suspect it's probably more toward that older age. But whether it was younger or older, the time that she had with the boy, she intentionally imparted a faith in him, because Samuel was going to the house of Eli as a young priest in the making. And he would be under Eli's authority. And Eli's house was not such a good place. His two boys, Hophnius and Phinehas, were the two priests serving. And they were bad boys. I mean, they were trouble. They exploited women. They exploited the people. They were horrible. In fact, God would ultimately bring his judgment on the house of Eli, killing the two boys, and Eli would eventually die, all because of the sins of his sons that he knew about, and he never rebuked them, it says. And here is Hannah taking this precious son of hers, who she's waited her whole life for and prayed for, and leaving him under the authority of Eli. That takes a tremendous faith. And I guarantee you, hours and hours of praying and preparation went in to all that. The point is, Hannah had a short time with Samuel, as all mothers do. We only have a short time with them. But she used that time to influence him to become a great man of faith. The world is influencing your children. Every day they're bombarded with false values. So the time that you have, moms and dads and grandparents, when they're young, is crucial. Influence them. Be intentional about influencing them for Christ. Well, let's finish this story up. In chapter 2 of 1 Samuel 1, it says that each year, she left Samuel under the house of Eli. It said each year, Hannah, Samuel's mother, made him a little robe, because he was a priest. He was a young priest in the making. Made him a little robe, and she took it to him when she came up and with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. So she would, she'd see him every year, and I suspect more than once a year. But when they'd go up for the annual sacrifice, the big event when the whole family got together and caravanned up to Shiloh, she would have been working all year on making his robe, and she'd be, imagining, now he's probably grown 2 inches. I better make this a little bit longer, and preparing that robe to take up to him. Chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, verse 19, it says, "And the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up. And all of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was a prophet of the Lord." Now, God blessed Hannah after Samuel because she honored her vow. God gave her, it says, many more children. So now Hannah's popping out a kid every year. But imagine this scene. Years later, maybe 20 years later, 15 years later, Elkanah's getting his wives together and all his kids, and at this point there's probably grandkids involved. And the whole clan gets together once a year for this annual event where they head to Shiloh. And everybody's excited. Everybody gets together. But now it's different, because not only are we going to the house of the Lord, but we get to see Samuel, who's recognized as the greatest prophet in the land. And he's our brother. I mean, how proud must Hannah have been to be taking that journey to Shiloh when everybody's so excited to see her son, the great prophet and priest in the land. How proud Elkanah must have been of this son of his, the focal point of religion in Israel. How proud Samuel's brothers and sisters must have been, his nieces and nephews. We can't wait. We're going to get to see Samuel. And how jealous Peninnah must have been as they're making that trip. And they see Samuel from a distance and everybody runs to him. Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. You see, when a praying mother partners with God, the result is going to be special children. Samuel thought a lot of his mother. I mean, he did. He didn't feel abandoned by his mother. He was grateful to his mother for what she did for him and for the kingdom of God. In fact, Samuel thought so much of his mother that he wrote this story. He wrote this account of his mother and her faith and her prayer. A little girl had a part in a church play or a church program. And she had one line to remember. And the line was, I am the light of the world. That was her line. So she and her mother practiced it, rehearsed it, and I am the light of the world, I am the light of the world. And the night came for the program at church. And all the kids got up and they each got to say their part. And when it came her turn, she just froze up. And she couldn't remember her line. And she just stood there, panicked, frozen. And finally, from about the third row back, her mother says, I am the light of the world. And the little girl said, what? I said, I am the light of the world. She goes, oh, my mother is the light of the world. Mothers, you are the light of the world. It's no picnic. It's no picnic. But today, more than ever, we need God-fearing mothers, women of faith, who pray for their children and are intentional about imparting the faith to the next generation. Let's pray.